The realization did not arrive as a single revelation but as a cumulative pressure that finally displaced long-held assumptions. For years, Hitler had interpreted the United States through a European lens, measuring it by diplomatic caution, peacetime production figures, and the apparent inefficiencies of a pluralistic society. In his mental framework, wars were decided by early blows, by operational audacity, and by the collapse of political will under strain. What unsettled that framework was not American entry itself, which he had anticipated and discounted, but the emerging evidence that the American system operated on a different temporal and material plane altogether, one in which time was an ally rather than an adversary. The context for this shift lay in the flow of intelligence reports that reached the Reich Chancellery in late 1942 and early 1943, documents that increasingly resisted optimistic interpretation. Attaché summaries from Berlin's remaining observers in neutral capitals, intercepted production data, and even open American congressional statements began to converge on a single, uncomfortable picture. Aircraft output figures were not merely rising, they were compounding. Shipyard tonnage projections exceeded the total combined capacity of Axis Europe, and they did so with a regularity that suggested administrative mastery rather than emergency improvisation. Unlike Germany, which balanced armaments against labor shortages, bombing damage, and ideological constraints, the United States mobilized without dismantling its civilian economy, expanding both simultaneously. As these reports accumulated, Hitler's internal logic began to strain. European war planning, even at its most ambitious, assumed ceilings, limits imposed by coal, steel, trained labor, transport bottlenecks, and political endurance. German industry, for all its efficiency, required rationalization, forced labor reallocations, and constant intervention to maintain output. American production curves, by contrast, appeared almost indifferent to friction. New factories came online as older ones expanded, assembly lines multiplied rather than optimized, and standardized designs replaced the German obsession with incremental technical superiority. The implication was not merely quantitative but structural. This was not an economy converting itself for war. It was an industrial ecosystem designed to absorb war as a function. The progression from skepticism to apprehension can be traced through Hitler's own recorded monologues and conference remarks. Initially, he dismissed American numbers as exaggerations intended for domestic morale, a familiar European tactic. But by mid-1943, after Speer's presentations forced direct comparison between German outputs and Allied forecasts, the tone shifted. The Führer began to speak of America not as a decadent power but as a continental factory state, protected by oceans, unbombed, and unburdened by the attrition consuming Europe. The manpower dimension compounded the problem. Mobilization figures indicated that American divisions could be raised, trained, and replaced at a pace that rendered German casualty calculus obsolete. Losses that would cripple a European army became, in American terms, operational setbacks rather than strategic crises. The climax of this realization lay in the recognition that traditional German advantages, initiative, operational tempo, and early technological lead, were losing relevance against an opponent unconstrained by scarcity. Intelligence estimates showed that even successful German campaigns merely accelerated American learning curves. Each engagement fed an industrial response measured not in months but in production cycles. Tanks destroyed translated into improved models rolling off lines already scaled for expansion. Aircraft losses generated not shortages but refinements, as feedback loops between front and factory shortened. Hitler grasped, perhaps too late, that this was a war of systems, and that Europe's wars of exhaustion bore little resemblance to what he had unleashed. The resolution was not acceptance but a hardening of ideological resolve. Unable to reconcile this material imbalance with his worldview, Hitler reframed the problem as one of will and destiny, retreating into the belief that political fractures would undermine American capacity before its material superiority could fully assert itself. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the strategic options narrowed. The war could no longer be won by outproducing or outlasting the enemy. It could only be won, if at all, by disrupting a system whose scale defied European precedent. In that unspoken acknowledgement lay the quiet understanding that the conflict had entered a phase where Germany no longer controlled the conditions of its own survival, having misjudged, at a fundamental level, the nature of the opponent it had drawn into the war. The shift was perceptible not in public declarations but in the narrowing circle of private conversations where performance gave way to calculation. As the war extended beyond the timelines Hitler had internalized since 1939, his internal reactions became increasingly shaped by duration rather than maneuver, by attrition rather than decision. Diaries from those admitted to his inner conferences record a leader who no longer spoke primarily of campaigns but of endurance, of holding structures together under pressures they had not been designed to bear. The early certainty that time itself favored Germany eroded quietly, replaced by a growing awareness that prolonged conflict transformed strengths into liabilities. The context for this internal recalibration lay in the accumulation of unresolved commitments. By 1942, Germany was engaged simultaneously across vast operational theaters, each demanding sustained flows of men, fuel, and material. What troubled Hitler privately was not the existence of multiple fronts, something he believed Germany could manage through will and initiative, but the realization that none of them were reaching a decisive conclusion. Staff briefings increasingly emphasized maintenance rather than expansion, replacement rates rather than breakthroughs. Reports from the Eastern Front detailed not dramatic collapses but grinding consumption, where territorial control translated into logistical burden rather than strategic advantage. In this environment, duration ceased to be neutral. It became an active force acting against German assumptions. As this understanding deepened, Hitler's internal reactions took on a more rigid, inward character. Accounts from Speer and Goebbels suggest that he became increasingly sensitive to discussions framed around limits, reacting sharply to any implication that Germany faced structural constraints comparable to its enemies. Yet these reactions were defensive rather than dismissive. Production tables, casualty statistics, and fuel balance sheets were studied with obsessive attention, not waved away. He fixated on bottlenecks, ball bearings, synthetic fuel output, rail capacity, not as abstract problems but as indicators of a system being asked to perform beyond its tolerances. The prolonged nature of the conflict forced him to confront the fact that German mobilization had been optimized for intensity, not sustainability. The progression toward a more fatalistic internal posture is evident in how Hitler began to conceptualize time itself. Early in the war, time was something to be compressed through rapid operations and decisive blows. As the conflict stretched on, time became something to be endured, even resisted. He spoke increasingly of holding actions, of buying months rather than seizing weeks, while privately acknowledging that every additional winter compounded difficulties that no amount of ideological resolve could fully offset. Intelligence summaries describing Allied training pipelines and reserve formations reinforced the sense that Germany's losses were final in a way the enemy's were not, a distinction that only sharpened with each passing campaign season. The climax of this internal reckoning emerged during periods of enforced immobility, particularly after major strategic reversals when action could no longer obscure arithmetic. In these moments, Hitler reportedly oscillated between intense focus and withdrawal, spending hours reviewing reports yet drawing fewer concrete conclusions from them. The implications of a prolonged conflict, industrial fatigue, cumulative manpower depletion, and the erosion of qualitative advantages were no longer theoretical. They were visible in the declining experience levels of replacements, in the increasing reliance on improvised formations, and in the constant need to redistribute scarce resources among competing crises. The war had become a test of systemic resilience rather than operational brilliance, a test Germany had not prepared to take. The resolution of these internal reactions was not a strategic pivot but a psychological hardening. Confronted with the implications of a war measured in years rather than campaigns, Hitler retreated further into ideological explanation, framing endurance itself as proof of historical necessity. Privately, however, the tone shifted from anticipation to containment, from shaping outcomes to delaying collapse. The prolonged conflict forced a recognition that control over events was slipping, replaced by reactive management of consequences already set in motion. In that recognition lay the quiet acknowledgement that the war's trajectory was no longer governed by intent alone, but by the cumulative weight of decisions made under assumptions that time itself would obey German design. The language shifted before the strategy did, and in that shift the recalibration became visible. In private conferences and controlled speeches, Hitler began to describe the United States not as an episodic participant or a distant arsenal, but as an adversary defined by continuity. The emphasis moved away from American intentions and toward American capacity, framed less as a question of resolve than of structural endurance. What emerged was a verbal architecture that treated the United States as a power insulated from the traditional pressures that had historically constrained European wars, a formulation that acknowledged durability without conceding inevitability. The context for this framing lay in the steady accumulation of comparative data that resisted dismissal. German intelligence assessments, including those circulated by the Wehrwirtschaftsamt, increasingly referenced American production as a baseline rather than an anomaly. Hitler's language began to mirror this shift. He spoke of America's ability to replace without pause, of factories that functioned as extensions of geography rather than national effort, and of manpower reserves integrated into industrial planning rather than mobilized in response to crisis. Unlike Britain or the Soviet Union, whose endurance he framed as contingent on aid or coercion, America was described as inherently inexhaustible, not because of ideology but because of scale. As this verbal framing developed, it became more precise and less rhetorical. Hitler contrasted German and American war economies in terms that revealed an uncomfortable clarity. Germany, he noted, fought within a closed system, one where every increase in output required trade-offs elsewhere, whether in civilian consumption, labor allocation, or long-term sustainability. America, by contrast, was depicted as operating an open system, one capable of expanding production without visibly cannibalizing its internal stability. This was not admiration but recognition. He referred to American shipyards launching vessels faster than German submarines could sink them, and to aircraft programs whose numerical growth rendered individual technical superiority strategically irrelevant. The enemy, in this framing, was not brilliant but relentless. The progression of this language is evident in how Hitler addressed duration. Early war rhetoric relied on the collapse of enemy morale under pressure. Later remarks treated American society as structurally resistant to exhaustion. He argued that distance shielded American industry from direct reprisal, while internal abundance dulled the political impact of losses. In conversations recorded by aides, he remarked that American casualties did not translate into immediate strategic consequences because replacement pipelines were already institutionalized. War, as he described it, was absorbed into the American system as a process rather than experienced as a rupture, an observation that fundamentally altered how he articulated the threat. The climax of this framing appeared when Hitler began to explicitly detach American power from traditional endpoints. He spoke of a state that could fight, as long as necessary, not as a boast but as a condition. In this formulation, victory was no longer about forcing exhaustion but about imposing costs faster than the enemy could metabolize them. America's ability to sustain war without visible degradation became, in his language, both its defining strength and its strategic vulnerability, a system so vast that only disruption at the structural level could matter. This rhetorical turn acknowledged that time favored the United States by default, a stark departure from earlier assumptions that prolonged war inevitably weakened democracies. The resolution of this verbal framing was a hardened dichotomy between European limits and American continuity. Hitler increasingly spoke of the war as a confrontation between bounded and unbounded systems, implicitly conceding that exhaustion, the classic lever of continental warfare, would not function as expected. Yet this recognition did not translate into moderation. Instead, it justified escalation in rhetoric, framing the conflict as one that could not be resolved through pressure alone but required decisive intervention against the mechanisms of endurance themselves. In describing America as an enemy capable of sustaining war indefinitely, Hitler articulated a reality he could neither reverse nor fully integrate into his strategic worldview. The language acknowledged permanence while still seeking rupture, revealing a leadership struggling to reconcile ideological certainty with an opponent defined by its immunity to fatigue. An unease began to surface in Hitler's language that had little to do with immediate setbacks and everything to do with arithmetic. It appeared not in moments of crisis but in reflective remarks, when urgency receded and the structure of the war asserted itself. Time, once treated as a variable to be mastered through speed and surprise, entered his vocabulary as an opposing force. Resources, previously discussed as instruments of will, were increasingly framed as finite quantities moving toward exhaustion. Inevitability, a concept he had long reserved for ideological triumph, was now invoked in darker, more conditional terms. The context for this anxiety lay in the slow convergence of reports that stripped away the illusion of elasticity. By 1943, briefings on fuel production, transport capacity, and replacement flows no longer offered optimistic margins. Synthetic fuel output was tracked against operational consumption with narrowing tolerances, and rail capacity was discussed less as a logistical tool than as a limiting factor subject to cumulative strain. Hitler's remarks began to reflect this compression. He spoke of time not as something Germany possessed but as something slipping away, each month adding weight to systems already operating near their limits. The war, in his framing, was no longer a contest of initiative but a race against depletion. As this awareness deepened, his language increasingly fused material considerations with historical determinism. Resources were no longer merely supplies to be allocated, they became measures of national endurance. In conferences, he returned repeatedly to comparisons of output curves and reserve depth, noting how German production required constant intervention to sustain momentum while enemy economies expanded with fewer visible constraints. Manpower discussions followed a similar pattern. Casualty figures were not treated as isolated losses but as irreversible subtractions from a shrinking pool, a reality sharpened by reports indicating that enemy forces absorbed losses without equivalent strategic consequence. Time amplified these asymmetries, transforming marginal disadvantages into structural threats. The progression of this anxiety is evident in how Hitler spoke about duration itself. Early war rhetoric treated prolonged conflict as inherently corrosive to coalitions. Later remarks acknowledged that duration favored those with scale and insulation. He began to describe the war in terms of calendars and cycles rather than campaigns, measuring prospects by seasons survived rather than objectives seized. Each delay, once a tactical choice, now carried strategic cost. His fixation on holding ground, even when operational logic suggested withdrawal, reflected an understanding that relinquishing territory also meant relinquishing time already paid for in blood and material. Time had become too expensive to spend lightly. The climax of this strategic anxiety emerged in moments when Hitler confronted projections rather than reports. Forecasts of fuel availability, aircraft output, and trained replacements forced him to engage with futures he could not shape through decision alone. In these discussions, inevitability entered his language not as prophecy but as pressure. He spoke of trajectories, of paths set in motion by earlier choices, and of the difficulty of reversing them under wartime conditions. The acknowledgement was implicit rather than explicit, that certain outcomes were becoming more probable not because of enemy brilliance but because of cumulative imbalance. The war's logic was asserting itself independently of intent. The resolution of this anxiety did not produce adaptation but rationalization. Faced with the convergence of time, resources, and probability, Hitler reframed constraint as destiny, interpreting narrowing options as confirmation of historical struggle rather than evidence of strategic overreach. His remarks increasingly emphasized endurance for its own sake, treating survival through each successive period as validation of purpose. Yet beneath this rhetoric lay a clear apprehension that the war's momentum was governed by factors beyond tactical correction. Time no longer promised opportunity, it imposed cost. Resources no longer enabled choice, they dictated limits. Inevitability, once claimed as a guarantee of victory, now hovered as a conditional outcome shaped by forces already in motion, revealing a leadership acutely aware that the war's conclusion was being written less by decision than by accumulation. The realization did not announce itself as defeat, but it quietly reoriented the mental map through which Hitler understood Germany's place in the conflict. What changed was not his belief in eventual victory, which remained ideologically fixed, but his sense of Germany's position within a war whose scale now extended beyond European precedent. The conflict was no longer framed as a contest in which Germany pressed forward from strength toward decision. It became a struggle to preserve leverage in a system increasingly defined by endurance, scale, and accumulation. In this altered perception, Germany was no longer the dynamic center of gravity but a power operating under tightening structural ceilings. The context for this shift lay in the slow confrontation with comparative reality. Reports circulating through the Führer headquarters made clear that German strength, though still formidable, rested on a finite industrial and demographic base already under strain. Armaments output continued to rise in absolute terms, yet when set against enemy trajectories, the increases appeared insufficient rather than decisive. Hitler began to perceive Germany as a state compelled to extract maximum effect from every marginal gain, while its opponents could afford inefficiency, delay, and loss without compromising long-term viability. This imbalance reframed Germany's strategic posture from one of expansion to one of preservation, even if the language of conquest remained intact. As this perception evolved, Hitler increasingly viewed Germany's long-term position as contingent rather than commanding. Time, once assumed to erode enemy coalitions, now threatened to erode Germany's relative advantages. Qualitative superiority in weapons and leadership, long treated as compensatory factors, appeared increasingly fragile when subjected to prolonged material pressure. In private remarks, he returned repeatedly to the problem of replacement, not only of equipment but of experience, acknowledging that veteran formations could not be regenerated indefinitely. Germany's position, in this view, depended on maintaining a narrowing band of superiority before material disparities overwhelmed operational finesse. The progression of this altered perception is visible in how Hitler conceptualized strategic choice. Decisions were no longer framed primarily around achieving decisive outcomes but around avoiding irreversible deterioration. He spoke of holding key industrial regions, safeguarding skilled labor pools, and preserving core production capacities as matters of existential priority rather than operational convenience. Germany's long-term position was now understood as something that could degrade incrementally, through attrition that did not announce itself in catastrophe but accumulated quietly across months and years. The danger lay not in sudden collapse but in gradual loss of maneuverability, as each decision closed off options faster than new ones could be created. The climax of this realization emerged when Hitler confronted the implications of irreversibility. Certain losses, once absorbed, could not be offset within Germany's system. Skilled workers killed at the front, synthetic fuel plants destroyed, transport networks degraded beyond rapid repair. These were not temporary setbacks but permanent reductions in capacity. In contrast, enemy losses appeared elastic, recoverable through scale and redundancy. Germany's long-term position, as Hitler now perceived it, rested on preventing the war from becoming a pure contest of replacement rates, a contest he increasingly understood Germany could not win on its own terms. The resolution of this altered perception did not produce strategic withdrawal or accommodation. Instead, it reinforced a siege mentality, in which Germany was seen as a fortress holding out against encirclement by superior material forces. Hitler's language emphasized resilience, internal cohesion, and the necessity of sustaining pressure despite unfavorable arithmetic. Yet beneath this posture lay a tacit acknowledgement that Germany's long-term position was defensive even when its actions were offensive. The war was no longer about reshaping the balance of power indefinitely, but about forestalling a future in which Germany's relative position diminished beyond recovery. In this recalibrated worldview, Germany was still central to history but no longer insulated from it. The realization altered Hitler's perception from one of controlling the trajectory of the war to one of operating within constraints imposed by scale and time. Victory remained imaginable, but it now depended on preventing the conflict from fully expressing its long-term logic. Germany's position was no longer that of an ascendant power imposing outcomes, but of a state fighting to keep the war within boundaries where its advantages could still matter, aware that once those boundaries were breached, the balance would shift irrevocably, regardless of will or intent. The significance of Hitler's words lay less in their surface defiance than in what they implicitly conceded. When he spoke about endurance, production, and the character of his enemies, he was no longer describing a war that bent naturally toward German advantage. His language acknowledged duration as a decisive factor in its own right, and in doing so, it revealed an understanding that the conflict had entered a phase where survival depended on resisting processes rather than defeating opponents. This was not a public admission of defeat, but it was an internal recognition that the war's structure favored those who could persist indefinitely without systemic breakdown. The context for this acknowledgement was the widening gap between intention and feasibility. Germany's war planning had been premised on compression, rapid campaigns, early resolution, and the exploitation of short-term asymmetries before material balances could assert themselves. By the middle years of the war, Hitler's remarks increasingly reflected awareness that this premise had failed. The conflict was no longer operating within a timeframe Germany had designed for. Industrial reports showed output rising yet never reaching parity with enemies whose production curves continued to climb. Manpower tables demonstrated that losses, once absorbed, could not be fully replaced without degrading quality. In this environment, to speak of endurance was to confront the uncomfortable fact that endurance itself was unevenly distributed. As his language evolved, Hitler began to frame the war in terms that quietly displaced victory as a realistic endpoint. He spoke of holding, sustaining, and resisting, verbs that implied postponement rather than resolution. These were not rhetorical slips but indicators of conceptual shift. The war was increasingly described as something to be lived through rather than concluded on favorable terms. His acknowledgement that certain enemies could fight without exhaustion carried a corollary that Germany could not do so indefinitely. This was not stated outright, but it was embedded in the contrast he drew between closed and open systems, between economies constrained by geography and those protected by distance and scale. The progression toward this broader meaning can be traced through the way Hitler treated time as an adversary rather than a neutral medium. Each additional year of war magnified disparities that no operational brilliance could erase. He recognized that German strength was front-loaded, dependent on early advantages that diminished as the conflict lengthened. The longer the war persisted, the more it shifted from a contest of leadership and initiative to one of replacement rates, industrial resilience, and institutional depth. His words increasingly reflected an understanding that Germany was fighting against the clock of its own limitations, while its enemies were fighting within systems designed to accommodate prolonged strain. The climax of this acknowledgement emerged when inevitability entered his vocabulary, stripped of triumphalism. Inevitability was no longer framed solely as the certainty of German victory, but as the unfolding of historical forces that constrained choice. In private remarks, he spoke of trajectories that could not be altered without conditions Germany no longer controlled. This was the language of a leader confronting the reality that the war's outcome was being shaped less by decisions in headquarters than by cumulative processes already in motion. To acknowledge a war that could not be outlasted was to recognize that time itself had become a strategic liability. The resolution of this realization was not capitulation but reinterpretation. Hitler reframed endurance as virtue, transforming the inability to outlast the enemy into a moral and historical test rather than a material problem. His words cast persistence as proof of legitimacy, even as they betrayed awareness that persistence alone could not reverse structural imbalance. This reframing allowed him to continue the war without resolving the contradiction at its core, that Germany was engaged in a struggle whose decisive variables lay beyond its capacity to control. In this broader meaning, Hitler's words stand as an acknowledgement of limits rather than intentions. They reveal a leader who understood that Germany was locked into a conflict defined by asymmetries of scale and duration it could not overcome through will or innovation alone. The war had become one Germany could fight, but not one it could indefinitely sustain on equal terms. That recognition did not alter policy, but it stripped away illusion. What remained was a confrontation with time itself, a contest Germany was not equipped to win by lasting longer than its enemies, only by preventing the war from fully becoming what it already was.